That's recording. It's recording.
I have been ordered to start, and since I always follow orders, we'll start. But I won't start because people are too spread out. So I want to invite you to come forward. I don't understand the human psychology, why the front row is always empty. Somebody explain to me, what is it about human beings that they avoid the front row?
They want to fool around in the back.
That's it. That's it. That's as good an excuse as any. Well, what? Our wonderful speaker for tonight. Oh, by the way, my name is Dimitri Rousopoulos, and I'm going to introduce Dan. And I want to say that Dan Chodorkoff is a very exceptional person, one of the most articulate ecologists that I know. And you're going to hear something tonight which is going to be very enlightening and also very moving, based upon a long experience of working with human beings, trying to open up their minds to a new approach to the whole question of ecology. So I hope you have a sharp pencil if you're of the old school, or a pen if you're of the middle school, or of a computer if you are on the, quote, modern school, because it's going to be very interesting. The second thing I'm going to say before I introduce Dan, now that the challenge of finding this building has been more or less mastered by the people who are here. I mean, I had to go through 3 different buildings, and I know this campus pretty well to get here. But along the road, I have to say that I met a lot of intelligent McGill students that helped direct me. So here we are. The other thing I would like to say is this, that tomorrow afternoon, although we're going to have a question and discussion period here, tomorrow afternoon, not far from here, on Park Avenue and Pine, or otherwise known as Avenue des Pins and Avenue du Parc, at 3720 on the second floor, 3720 Avenue du Parc, Park Avenue on the second floor. There's going to be a very, very personable and very interesting workshop with Dan. And if you leave tonight frustrated that the discussion that took place was not elaborate enough or not satisfactory enough to you, that is a wonderful opportunity for you to get into the nuts and bolts of the subject matter in greater detail. And there's also going to be a buffet, something to eat and drink, I've been told. So you're welcome to that, and it starts at 4 o'clock.
Why so early?
Okay? Why so early? Because we're against the working class. No, it's because Dan has to get home. He has to get into his car, and he has to drive across the border. They may let him back into his country. So if he gets back past the border, then he has quite a list to go into Middle Vermont or wherever he is. So we have to think that of him, because we're very grateful that he drove up, and tomorrow late afternoon he's going to drive back. The very last thing I'm going to say is that handsome young man over there, Nathan McDonald, who is the organizer of events like this for our speaker series, has brought some exceptional books for you to look at that are related to the subject matter. And Nathan told me that the books are available at a discount.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, there you are. So seize the moment, as they say.
Do you want to also mention that we're going to do the talks and the book fair in 2 weeks?
You don't have a piece of literature to give them, but you do have an attendance sheet that is going
That's
to
right.
go around. And anybody who signs up on the attendance sheet will get a notice of a very important book sale that we're going to have on the 24th of February. Okay? Now, as the promo for this event said, so I'm not going to repeat it, Dan is an anthropologist with a PhD from the School of Social Research in New York, this minor place of higher education in the United States, where all sorts of luminaries went. I can't list them all. But it's a very important center, and he is, as you know, an anthropologist. But in my books, more importantly, he was the co-founder with the great Murray Bookchin of the Institute of Social Ecology in Plainfield, Vermont. And he's going to mention something about that and what's happening and so on and so forth. So without taking up more of your time, I would like to welcome most warmly Dan Chodorkoff.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Dimitri, Nathan, for your efforts organizing this, and thanks to all of you for coming out on this chilly evening. I appreciate it. What I want to do tonight is talk to you around the general theme of social transformation, because it's my belief that if we are to in fact deal in a sufficient way with the current climate crisis, it will only be through a basic transformation of our society. And by that I mean a revolutionary transformation. Transformation of the political and economic institutions that govern our lives today and that have brought about this crisis. And I want to begin with a disclaimer. I'm not a scientist, as Dimitri mentioned. I'm a cultural anthropologist. I'm firmly rooted in a tradition in anthropology that grows out of the humanities, though certainly we don't eschew science and anthropology, and we use it. The primary lens through which I view the world is one of participant observation. And I'm going to share some of my observations with you tonight and talk a little about some of the movements that I'm privileged enough to participate in as well. I think even without a scientific background, it's pretty clear to anyone with their eyes open today that we are truly in the midst of a crisis. The degree of climate change that we're facing is unprecedented in the history of humanity on the planet. It is without a doubt the greatest crisis that we have faced in terms of the completely global implications that it has, and we're already seeing horrific impacts, which unfortunately are only going to get worse as time goes on unless we make some basic changes in the direction that our society is moving. The depths of the climate crisis are difficult to describe, and I'll really leave that up to the scientists because we're getting new reports every day about the acceleration of glacial melting in Greenland and rising sea levels in the Arctic, open sea lanes where none ever existed. We're seeing incredible disruptions to local systems as various superstorms move through. Just this past summer, of course, we had 3 storms that were of unprecedented strength and severity. And the cost in human terms and economic terms, and certainly in ecological terms, wow, that's interesting, are immense. But I want to suggest to you that the climate crisis is not an environmental crisis. Certainly it has a tremendous effect on our environment, but the real roots of the crisis are social in nature. The environment does not create crises. Left on its own, first nature, the natural world, natural systems are homeostatic, they're self-regulating, they find a way to maintain balance through all kinds of fluctuations of individual species and to absorb individual events of tremendous magnitude. So it's not really an environmental crisis. The roots of this crisis are clearly social, and the impact that it's having, I think, too, is primarily social. Not that the environment, not that other species are not being impacted, certainly they are, but once again, nature has a way of evening out those fluctuations and maintaining itself. And I have no doubt that the planet will continue even if humanity doesn't. But we are literally in danger of the continuation of humanity, of our species at this point. This was really brought home to me in a very graphic way a few years ago when I was up in Barrow, Alaska. Barrow is the northernmost settlement in North America. It's at the confluence of the Chukchuk and Arctic Oceans. Traditionally, it's now an oil boom town and a boom town for climate scientists because Barrow is really on the front lines of the current climate crisis. The kinds of rises in sea level that we're seeing and anticipating in the rest of the world are greatly magnified in the Arctic. And don't ask me to explain the physics of that because I can't. But I believe what the scientists there told me, that they're looking at sea level rises that are going to essentially put Barrow and the whole peninsula underwater. And it's traditionally the home of the Inupiaq people. They've lived there for about 4,000 years. I was there right after they'd completed their traditional seasonal whale hunt. They hunt bowhead whales, which are not an endangered species. They limit their take according to the Indigenous Whaling Commission's recommendations. But nonetheless, it's something that has sustained their community for thousands and thousands of years, literally. And when we were there, we were told that they were already, and this is about 4 years ago, seeing tremendous disruptions of their traditional lifeways. They could still go out in the ocean in their 16-foot skin-covered boats, umiaks, and hunt whales, sealskin boats. They could kill the whales, but when they got them to the ice pack in order to drag them over the ice to get them to their villages, the ice wasn't thick enough to hold the whales any longer. And also traditionally they would store their meat in the permafrost. They would dig down 14, 20 feet into the permafrost and have permanent refrigeration to store their whale meat. And now, of course, the permafrost, even then, was already melting and making that storage system impossible for them. So we see a lot of images coming out of the Arctic of starving polar bears, of disappearing ice. But I'd ask people to keep in mind the image of the Inupiaq people, who are in the process of losing their livelihood, their traditions, their culture, which has persisted in this region for 4,000 years. When I was there, they'd already lost 18 feet of their beach. One of the barrier islands was underwater. They had to relocate a whole village. So that really brought it home for me in human terms. And of course, they're a tiny community and a very marginalized community in a distant part of the world. But the impacts that populations, not unlike ourselves, are facing are really prefigured by what's happening to the Inupiaq people. So I don't doubt for a minute the severity of the crisis we face. And I don't doubt for a minute that it is social in nature, that it's a result not of individuals so much, we're told that we're greedy consumers and the fact that we drive our cars and that we consume our fossil fuels and live in a society in which we really have no choice but to consume those fuels. We're told that we bear responsibility, that an abstract humanity bears responsibility for that crisis. And I would suggest to you that that's not the fact, that the impact that all of us as individuals have in our whole lifetimes is not equal to what the impact of one day's drilling on an offshore oil platform has on the climate crisis. So we need to really begin to sharpen our analysis, I think, and begin to identify what the real source of these problems are. I'm a social ecologist. I'm not an environmentalist. I would make the contrast this way. An environmentalist looks at a problem and says, oh, we can solve that with technology. For example, the pressing problem of acid rain, which I'm sure you're aware of here in Quebec, certainly in Vermont where I live, was a big problem through the 70s and 80s. The tall stacks putting particulate matter, sulfur dioxide into the air in the Midwest, where there are big industrial plants and big generating facilities, and the prevailing winds carrying that sulfur dioxide to the mountains of Vermont, where it falls as acid rain. It's destroying our maple trees, which of course are iconic in Vermont, destroying our lakes, destroying our fish stocks. Big problem. An environmentalist looked at that problem and said, well, solution is simple. We'll put scrubbers on the smokestacks and clean up those emissions. That's the problem. Well, to a certain extent, that's true. And I certainly don't oppose putting scrubbers on smokestacks. But as a social ecologist, I always try to take the analysis to the next level, to understand that yes, smokestacks putting particulates and sulfur dioxide in the air is the problem. But really, if you analyze that further, we see that the problem is centralized forms of industrial production that depend on fossil fuels. And if you take that analysis further, you say that those centralized forms of production are a result of a rapacious form of capitalism, which has really taken over the world and is driving us towards not just the climate crisis, but any number of other crises that we might try to identify. And then as a social ecologist, I take that analysis even further and say it's not just capitalism that's the problem. It's a culture which is rooted in relationships of hierarchy and domination. And it's not just hierarchy and domination that's the problem, it's people's attitude towards the natural world and their attempt to dominate nature, which grows out of human relationships of hierarchy and domination. That is really the root of the problem. So social ecology is a very radical discipline in the sense that it tries to get to the root of the problem. So for me as a social ecologist, the solution is not to put a scrubber on a smokestack. The solution is to end relationships of hierarchy and domination and create a society which is based on a very different, qualitatively different set of principles, organizational principles. And for social ecology, our goal, of course, is the harmonization of people and nature, the creation of an ecological community in which humanity has a particular role, but not the kind of destructive and hierarchical role that we have today, which has led us to our futile attempts to dominate nature. The climate crisis clearly demonstrates that we can't dominate nature. So social ecology then looks for a qualitatively different kind of society. And it's one, if our goal is in fact to reharmonize people in the natural world, one that we believe has to be rooted in a new understanding of nature itself. And there's a whole philosophy of social ecology that delineates what nature is. There's an epistemology. We understand nature's natural history, not as simply grass, trees, mountains, something out there that we're separate from, but rather as the whole of natural evolution. And we see humanity as a part of that, not separate from it. But we also see that humanity, that people play a distinct role. And that role is one which has unfortunately become extremely destructive. So if we're to reharmonize those relationships, social ecology suggests we need a new ethical framework on which we can base a new set of social institutions. And we look towards natural evolution and nature itself to understand where we might derive those ethical principles. Nature is the source of those ethical principles. Social ecology sees certain tendencies in nature, and of course people look at nature and you see everything in nature because nature contains everything. But as we hone our analysis, we see certain key aspects of evolution which have been de-emphasized, and I think that de-emphasis has come largely as an outgrowth of capitalism, largely as an outgrowth of hierarchical ways of thinking and systems of thought. And it's led us to ignore certain tendencies in nature which social ecology thinks we need to revive, emphasize, and place in an ethical framework as a guideline for creating a new ecological society. And among those are the fact that nature is non-hierarchical. There's no hierarchy in nature. Ecologists used to speak of food chains. Now they talk about food webs. They recognize the interrelationships of all species. And even within species, when we see hierarchy among the lion as king of beasts or the lowly ant, we're anthropomorphizing, and we're projecting human hierarchies where they really don't exist. Technical definition of a hierarchy, of course, is a system of command and control, institutionalized, that ultimately has recourse to physical coercion. And those hierarchies abound in our society, but we don't see them anywhere else in nature. Even the so-called alpha male in a gorilla group, the silverback gorilla, supposedly he's at the apex of that group, but it's not a hierarchical relationship. It's not institutionalized, and it's not exclusive. Supposedly the alpha male is the one who breeds with the females, but observations in the wild have shown that while that alpha male is preoccupied, another male in the troop has slipped off into the woods with a female and they're procreating. So even those quasi-hierarchies in nature are not hard and fast. And there's certainly no institutionalized form of physical coercion to enforce those relationships. So nature is non-hierarchical, number one. Number two, nature is mutualistic. I referred already to the interrelationships and interdependencies which exist in ecosystems. So non-hierarchical, mutualistic. Nature demonstrates unity and diversity. We know that the most stable ecosystems are those that have the greatest number of species interacting between them. And they also have the greatest ability to adapt to changes, even dramatic changes, declines, fluctuations in any given population within that ecosystem, because there are a multiplicity of species at every trophic level in a complex ecosystem. So we see that unity in diversity is another principle that social ecology says we need to look at and find some way to apply in human society if we are to achieve an ecological society. We also know nature is homeostatic. It's not static. It's constantly changing. It's constantly growing. There's death, there's birth, decomposition. That's the essence of an ecosystem, those kinds of relationships. And yet through it all, they manage to maintain a kind of balance, a dynamic balance. So that's another principle. We also see in natural evolution a movement towards ever greater degrees of complexity, diversity, and freedom, with freedom understood as consciousness and self-consciousness. So these are some of the aspects of evolution, tendencies within evolution, which our society has devalued and largely ignored. And social ecology suggests that they provide the basis really for a reconstructive project that can begin to bring us in harmony with the rest of nature. And suggests as well that these are necessary changes, a necessary ethical framework that has to be translated into action if we're to escape the current crisis. Now, I believe this talk was advertised as climate change or system change in the age of Trump. And there's a lot that can be said about the age of Trump. It's horrifying, and I wake up every day to a new horror. And if you follow the news in the States, no doubt you are waking up to the same horrors. But this is really an unprecedented political development. I mean, I've lived through some pretty horrible times in the States. The repression of the Nixon era, Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, and the invasion of Iraq, all of that, but it all pales in comparison to Donald Trump. Donald Trump has sped up the news cycle to this to the degree that what once would have been 6 months worth of news is now not even worthy of mention on the front page, because it's one outrage piled on another. Things are really bad, folks, and they're getting worse. Not just in terms of policies, and the policies are pretty terrible. If you followed the Trump administration at all, you know of his Scott Pruitt, the head of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, who came to that job from a post as Attorney General in a state where he consistently filed lawsuits to try to overturn regulations imposed by the EPA. It's like putting the fox in charge of the hen house. And that's what they've done. And in what's really only a year, it's hard to believe it's only been a year, but they have deregulated and devastated that agency, which was inadequate to begin with in terms of funding and the scope of its mission and what it was able to accomplish. But all of that now is being reversed. It's being decimated. We also see in the arena of energy policy a Trump administration, which of all things is trying to revive the coal industry in the United States. Unbelievable and futile. I mean, you know, he was all about we're going to bring back coal and clean coal and we're going to reopen the mines and put the miners back to work. We've lost 1,200 jobs out of the 12,000 existing jobs, remaining jobs in the coal industry since Trump came into office, but that's not slowing him down. He sent a delegation to the last climate talk where they were promoting the use of coal and natural gas. He's just slapped a tariff on solar collectors from China, which represent about 80% of the solar market in the US, trying to slow down that development. And these are all examples of the kind of destructive policies that Trump has created, but even beyond the policies, he's created a climate in the US of growing fascism, and I will call it that. You know, his support for the neo-Nazis who marched in Charlottesville, he's the darling of the alt-right, his clearly racist policies, his policies on immigration, his policies in the Justice Department, which has now reversed all of the progressive kinds of policies that were established by Obama. This is all a harbinger of what I fear could be a real fascist coup, and we may be on the verge of that. If you follow the press in the US at all, august institutions like the New York Times have been talking about the coming constitutional crisis, which Trump is bringing on. So things are bad in the US today. And unfortunately, that has implications for the rest of the world as well. So we're seeing a confluence of these various crises into one overarching crisis. It is certainly environmental, and it's going to affect all of us that way. It already has. The superstorms, the barrier islands that are disappearing, the forest fires on the West Coast. All of those are symptoms of the climate crisis, but there's also a growing social and political crisis that this monster, this orange Caligula, has precipitated.
Orange baboon.
Yeah, well, that's what some comedian called him, and then Trump sued him for $1 million. At any rate, it's pretty grim. But I don't want to focus on the crisis tonight, because I think we're all too aware of it. But it is sobering. It's something that we have to, unfortunately, I can't escape it. It's in the back of my mind all the time. Every time I pick up a newspaper or turn on my computer or watch the news on TV, there's a new reminder and a new outrage. In the US, there is a response, however. The majority, despite his election, because of a particularly arcane electoral system in the US in which the popular vote doesn't mean anything, apparently. He was elected president, but he's only supported by something like 34% of the American people at this point. That's what his approval rating is. So there is, of course, opposition. And that opposition has taken on the name of the resistance. Sounds like something out of Star Wars, the resistance. What the resistance consists of in the US at this point is primarily single issue groups. And there are a multitude of issues on which one can be opposed to Donald Trump and his policies and his minions. But the primary groups are people of color, where we see the Black Lives Matter movement coming to the fore even before Trump's election. We're seeing immigrants and groups that support immigrants playing an important role in that resistance. We're seeing feminists play an important role in that resistance. We're seeing environmentalists and ecologists play an important role in that resistance as well. But I have to tell you that the resistance is not unified. Resistance is fragmented. And it's in part because of the way people are conceiving of activism in the US today, which is largely in a framework which is siloed. So that you look at your issue and I look at my issue, and if you can support my issue, that's great, but there's no real connection. Rather, Black Lives Matter advocates for black people. And make no mistake about it, this is a vitally important issue. It's crucial. It's necessary that we oppose the racism and police violence that Black Lives Matter speaks to. It's also true that immigrants are in the midst of their own crisis today, as Trump's policies have decimated immigrant populations, have deported all kinds of people, broken up families, and his rhetoric is even worse than his actions. And if we are to believe his rhetoric, things are only going to get worse on that front. So certainly we need to fight for immigrants' rights. We need to support the DACA kids. There's a huge debate going on today. All of that is necessary and vitally important. And certainly women's issues. The Trump presidency has highlighted them like never before. The fact that the molester-in-chief can get away with what he does is, I mean, we heard his words, his Planet Hollywood tape, where he bragged about assaulting women. We know he was accused by no less than 19 women of sexual assault and molestation. He was elected nonetheless. And now, of course, with the Me Too movement, even more is coming out about Trump. I mean, you may have missed this story because it was only, a page 6. As they are not sufficient. And that's important to understand, I think. That as long as we're siloed, as long as we're looking at single issues and individual struggles, we're missing the point. And the point is, and of course there is a growing awareness of this. These siloed movements talk about intersectionality. They're beginning to recognize ways in which the struggle of people of color intersects with the struggles of women and the struggles of other oppressed people. Environmentalists also are waging necessary struggles against pipelines, against specific fossil fuel projects, against the increasing destruction and degradation of the environment. Also completely necessary, but not sufficient. What we need to do is recognize not just the intersection of these individual issues, but the underlying cause of them all. And that is a system which puts profits before people, a system which has no regard for the environment, which thinks only in terms of bottom line and short-term gain, a system which is rooted in maintaining the hierarchies and the relationships of domination which have characterized Western society, well, certainly with a few shining exceptions, since the rise of civilization. So these movements are necessary, but they're not sufficient. What would be sufficient? And is there any hope that we can develop a movement which is sufficient to actually begin to challenge this underlying system which creates all of these various problems and crises? Social ecology would suggest that we can create a movement, and that in fact, I would tell you from my observations and my experience that there is a growing movement which understands the interconnection, the interrelationship of these various problems and various issues. It is not intersectional, it is holistic, it is ecological, in the sense that it tries to understand the underlying dynamics and look at the whole picture and look at the interrelationships between the various parts of the system. In that sense, it is an ecological movement. And it is also, and I say this with some trepidation because the word has been so misused, it is a utopian movement. It's a movement which is not only critical, which not only understands what's problematic about what is, but also has a very distinct vision of what could be and what should be. And that is an ecological vision. It's holistic, it's rooted in those principles that I mentioned earlier. It's non-hierarchical, it's mutualistic, it recognizes the strength of unity in diversity. It moves towards ever greater degrees of diversity, complexity, and freedom. And hopefully it is homeostatic. In other words, it will be able to sustain itself over time. Because unfortunately, what we've seen with many of these other movements is that they're centered around a particular campaign or a particular issue, and when that issue is dealt with, they dissipate, they disappear. What we need are movements which come together to organize around sustained vision of basic social change, a revolutionary vision, by which I mean a willingness to critically examine and reimagine the basic institutions that govern our lives. A new definition of economics, a new definition of politics, and new forms for these which can be institutionalized and which reflect those principles that I discussed earlier. And I do see the beginnings of those kinds of movements around us in the US today, and that's exciting. And it's also a place where we can begin to be a little optimistic. So these movements are utopian, not in the sense that they seek some kind of cloud cuckoo land, something fantastical and unachievable, but rather they do seek something which is qualitatively different from what is today and that transcends the given. And without that kind of imaginary, without that kind of vision, I fear we're doomed to simply replicate the kinds of single issue battles that we've been fighting for many years. And I don't want to denigrate those battles. They're, as I said, they're vitally important, but there has to be some way to try to connect them up and to connect them up with this larger vision for social change. And that's the way that we can begin to address the climate crisis. Anything short of that is going to fall short. We know that mere policy change, well, it can be rewritten with the stroke of a pen. Donald Trump's pen, in this case. We know that, in fact, the institutions and the political systems that have gotten us into this mess, even though they recognize that we are in a crisis, they lack the ability or the will to actually make the necessary changes to alleviate that crisis. Even if we were to implement the COP, the Paris Accords, scientists have analyzed them. They said they're insufficient. Even were we to fulfill those goals, we would still not stem the climate crisis. And we're not fulfilling those goals. We're falling far behind fulfilling those goals. So I'd suggest to you that the current political actors and economic actors who are setting policies are in fact incapable of dealing with this crisis. So we really need a new vision. We need a utopian vision. We need something that transcends the given, but nonetheless is rooted in real existing potentialities. That's what I mean when I use the word utopia. It's, it's always been bandied about as a pejorative or dismissive. Oh, that's utopian. Oh, that can never happen. No, that's not what I mean. I'm using it in the original sense, or one of the original senses. Thomas More coined the word in 1515. He talked about utopia as having two roots, both from the ancient Greek, one the word utopia, which means no place, the other the word utopia, which means the good place. And we're talking about the good place. And once again, bear with me, I'm going to riff on this whole utopian idea for a moment here, because I think it's important. There's not a unified utopia. There's not a global utopian vision. There's rather a set of utopian principles. And I'd suggest these are the principles of social ecology. And they need to be applied and worked through in individual communities. And they'll take a different form in different places, depending on the particulars of the environment, cultural history of that community. So rather than a single unified utopia, we need to develop a multiplicity of utopias. Okay. So what is going on today that we can draw some inspiration from, that we can draw some hope from? Because I don't want to leave folks without hope. I think it's vitally important that we maintain, even in the midst of this crisis, a sense of possibilities, not a Pollyanna-ish, oh, it's all going to work out okay kind of attitude, but rather a realistic understanding that if we are able to develop the social and political will to transform our institutions, we still have a chance to stem the worst of the climate crisis. So what I see today is a growing movement of people working in their own communities, not on single issues, but taking a holistic approach and understanding that community itself is the antidote to the state and to the hierarchical institutions that have created this crisis. That right outside our doors, we have neighbors, we have various forums that we can begin discussions in and with that can start to help us develop these visions and find ways to actualize them and to implement them. Social ecology suggests that there are 3 different levels on which this work has to go forward, and I'm in touch with groups all over the US and all over the world who are working with these ideas and trying to implement them. So we need, number one, to be very, very critical. We need to undertake a critical examination, a fulsome critique of current conditions. And we need to do that in a way which is informed by a great deal of study and understanding. Murray Bookchin, who Dimitri mentioned at the beginning of this talk, really my mentor and dear colleague until his death about, I think it's 12 years now, Dimitri, since he's gone. He wrote 25 books about all of this stuff, by the way, and Black Rose publishes many of them, so if you want to learn more about his vision and his work, you have a very good resource right here in Montreal. But Bookchin suggested that every revolutionary project is an educational project. I agree wholeheartedly. It's what we've tried to do over the years with the Institute for Social Ecology, is educate people about these ideas. So education is a necessary component, and it happens on a couple of different levels. We have to educate ourselves, obviously, and we have to educate others. And I'd suggest that education doesn't happen simply in a classroom. It happens in many settings. And the kind of education that's needed is one which will not limit itself to formal settings, but rather will occur when we meet together in a neighborhood, over the kitchen table with our friends, through the formation of study groups, and through participation in various forms of social action. This is how we begin to develop a praxis, which is, of course, a combination of theory and practice, in which one begins with a set of ideas, applies them in the real world, sees how they work out, analyzes those outcomes, and then revises the theory in relation to the experience and puts them in practice again. And it's an ongoing process. So we need that kind of critical educational praxis. Okay. Maybe this one will stand still. So, and then once we're educated, or as a part of our education, I should say, because I don't think that we can really separate practice, putting the ideas into practice, and education, because part of the education is putting the ideas into practice. But we need to, of course, continue to be oppositional. We need to say, no, you can't build that pipeline here. We need to say, no, you can't continue killing unarmed black children. We need to say, no, you can't harass women in the workplace. No, you can't assault women. No, you can't dump pollutants into that river. All of this, of course, takes the form of traditional protest movements, and they're vitally important. Once again, totally necessary. Because if we can't stop the worst excesses of Trumpism today, we won't have an opportunity tomorrow. They're consolidating power very quickly. It's frightening in the US to see how quickly the whole Republican Party is now under the sway of this monster. And they're backing him to the hill with, one or two exceptions. So we need to keep the pressure on. We need to be opposition. At the same time, we also need to create alternatives. And here this means organizing. And I would advocate once again for organizing where you live in your community. We need to create new forms of association, new economic forms. We need to create cooperatives. We need a whole cooperative economy which can begin to combat the capitalist economy. And it will develop in parallel. And it is developing. We're seeing this. We've seen it certainly here in Canada over a period of many years. Dimitri reminded me it's going to be 50th anniversary of the Milton Park cooperatives coming up next year. That's significant. But we need not just housing cooperatives and land trusts, we also need food cooperatives and producers cooperatives. And there are many, many models for this, successful models around the world. This is certainly qualitatively different from what happens under a capitalist economy, but it's not cloud cuckoo land. It's very realistic. It's being done, and it's been done, and there's a long history of cooperative enterprises and cooperative economics. And we need to understand that and build on it and expand that. So that creation of alternatives is vitally important. And we need to create alternative political structures as well. Here, once again, I would advocate for neighborhood assemblies. The idea is that if we are to actually create a force that can combat with power against the state, it will require organization. And that organization should reflect those ecological principles that I keep referring back to. It should be non-hierarchical, it should be horizontal, rather than built from the top down. It should allow for people's full participation in democratic forums. And once again, this is not cloud cuckoo land. There's a long history of the forms of freedom. Going back, certainly we can look at First Nations and we can look at the way that they functioned politically. And they were highly political, by the way. It wasn't simply some kind of, tribal tradition. These were people acting on their behalf, making decisions that would directly affect their lives, and doing so in a directly democratic fashion, for the most part. So there's that history. And then, of course, there's the history of the Athenian polis, the first direct democracy in the Western tradition. There are examples from medieval folk mode that one can draw on and learn from. There's, in my part of the world, the New England Town Meeting, which has been going on for almost 300 years. I live in a little town in Vermont where we function through direct democracy, through town meeting government. And it works. Of course, that's a little town in Vermont, and you might say, oh, well, it's homogeneous, there's no real diversity there, and people all agree anyways, so what's the big deal? Well, there's limited diversity, but people don't always agree. And when we disagree, we find ways to work through those disagreements and make decisions and function as neighbors and as citizens. And that New England Town Meeting as I say, is a long-standing tradition and one that we can learn from. And I've also seen that same model of town meetings used in New York City, where I worked for many, many years in a Puerto Rican community, a ghetto called Lower East Side on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, a neighborhood of about 30,000 people where they held quarterly town meetings, and they turned their neighborhood around as a result. They took on the function of the official city planning in their assembly. They took on creation of new economic forms and cooperative forms. They created food co-op, they created a credit union, they created a fuel oil purchasing co-op. They went into abandoned buildings and took them over as squatters and created low-income tenants cooperatives through a process known as sweat equity urban homesteading. They created community gardens and vacant lots. And these are all arenas in which we can begin to act in our own neighborhoods as well.
So where was this last place?
This is Lower East Side. It's the Hispanic section of the Lower East Side of Manhattan, which is the traditional portal of immigration. Neighborhood was 80% Puerto Rican and Dominican when I was working there. I wish I could send you there to see the community gardens and the cooperative buildings that we created with solar collectors on the roofs and windmills and solar greenhouses. But unfortunately, it was such a successful process that the neighborhood became gentrified, so there are only remnants of that left. And there's a lesson there too. That I think we need to be very aware of, that when you begin this reconstructive process, you really are creating community. And that's a very attractive thing because it addresses a basic human need. And it's one which increasingly is being disregarded and destroyed. We're a society that has no real regard for that tradition, that communal tradition. So, I'm suggesting then that we need to continue to be oppositional. We need to create alternatives. And very importantly, we also need to move forward in the realm of politics. But here, I think we really have to begin to redefine politics. Not as statecraft, not as going to the polls, once every 4 years and pulling a lever, but rather as active participation in making decisions that affect our lives. I don't think there's a neighborhood in the world that would support policies that are bringing about climate change. I can't imagine it. Because when you bring things down to that human scale, when you have relationships that are non-hierarchical and non-bureaucratized, but instead are based on affective ties, face-to-face relationships between people, you don't see those kinds of destructive developments tolerated. You simply don't. I have to say, as an anthropologist, I'm struck always. I've done some study of tribal people, pre-literate people, so-called egalitarian societies, hunters and gatherers. And I have to tell you that in a society like that, a character like Donald Trump would have been demonized. He would have been excommunicated. He would have been banished from the community. Because communities understand that those kinds of individuals with their greed and avarice are incredibly destructive. So unfortunately, we live in a society that instead of ostracizing those kinds of people, we celebrate them. In the US, we elected him president, and it's pretty terrifying to think about. At any rate, to get back to politics, what we're talking about is really a redefinition of politics. Not statecraft, not simply voting, but rather creating forums in which people can begin to exercise their sovereignty, in which people can begin to actually take back the decision-making power which we have so readily handed off to the bureaucrats and the politicians. And we can do that through a process, at least in the US, which is constitutional and legal, and will certainly require confrontation, and will require a great deal of hard work, but nonetheless, it is possible. It's not a revolution in the sense of the 19th century where people end up on the barricades facing down the army. The armatorium of the state is ridiculous these days. Trump will just drop a nuclear bomb on your neighborhood. So The idea is rather to create a counter power that can then begin to contest for power with the state. And this whole question of power, I think, is very important too, because there is a tendency that I've seen over many years, working with various progressive groups on the left, to shy away from any idea of power. You know, we don't want power. We don't want any power. Well, I hate to tell you, folks, power exists. In society, there is always power because there are always decisions being made. So the question is, what kind of power? Is it going to be power over? Are we going to bow down and accept that Donald Trump should be making decisions for us? Or is it going to be power with? And if we can begin to create these kinds of institutions that can contest for power, we can create power with. We can ensure that those voices which remain silent today are heard, and heard in meaningful ways. We can begin to decentralize power and bring it back down to the neighborhood level. And that's a level at which each individual in this room has an equal voice and an ability to participate in a meaningful way. And once again, based on my own experience, I've seen it happen. You know, my town in Vermont, it's not as ethnically diverse as I would like, but there's great diversity of political opinions there. There are revolutionaries and there are Trump supporters in my town. But when we come together as a community to make decisions, we're there as neighbors. And even though discussion can get heated, disagreements certainly exist, we find a way to coexist and we find a way to make decisions that benefit our community as a whole. So I know it can be done because I've experienced it. So, at any rate, we create then these counter forces in our neighborhoods, but also recognize that there is a need for coordination. You know, the state isn't a very effective instrument in a certain sense because it does have the ability to create policies and make decisions which then allow for a unified effort. And clearly there are some arenas in which we need those unified efforts if we want to have a transportation system or a communication system, et cetera, et cetera. But this decentralized approach that I'm advocating for has a flip side. The other side of the coin of decentralization is the idea of confederation, which means that the local decisions are brought together at a municipal level, then at a regional level, then at a continental level, and ultimately at a global level so that we can coordinate our activities, so that we can make sure that a decision made about a river in one town isn't going to pollute the drinking water of the town downriver. Once again, we need a set of principles that inform our actions, but we also need a way to coordinate our actions. And this can be done. And there, once again, there are historical models for how that was done. The Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy. They were incredible. And they had tremendous ability to both coordinate activity between the 5 tribes and at the same time respect not just individual communities, but individuals. This is fascinating stuff. If you've read about the Iroquois Confederacy or the Midwest Confederacy also, you know that they were very powerful, that they were able to marshal tremendous resources, and at the same time, they allowed for any individual who had a moral objection to a decision that was made to step aside and not participate. So they found a way to balance that individual rights and collective needs, and we need to do the same. So I've been going on for a while, and I think I'll try to bring things to a close at this point. You know, what I want to say in closing is that I can't emphasize enough the need for us to begin to move in this direction, to begin to develop a new sensibility, a new ethical grounding for our actions, and then to take those ethics into the realm of politics and into the realm of social reconstruction. And it's really, I believe, only by undertaking a massive process of social reconstruction, a revolutionary process of social reconstruction, that we can begin to address the climate crisis. And I'm confident that we can. And I will end with one of my favorite quotes from Margaret Mead, famous anthropologist, who said, "Never doubt for a moment the ability of a small, committed group of people to change the world. In fact, that's the only thing that ever has." So we'll leave it at that. And I guess questions. Yes.
Just before we get started, if I may, just the clipboard with the people's names on it ended up over here. I don't know if there's anybody else who wants to sign it or
Yes,
hasn't got it.
it's important to get your coordinates if you want to continue to be on our mailing list and continue to be invited to events like this, okay? Now, I want to repeat that we were exposed today, this evening, to a very large and very rich tableau of ideas, of analysis, of perspectives, of the present and the future. But our time is limited, and we're going to limit the discussion, whether we like it or not. But we do have an opportunity again tomorrow in the workshop to get into the richness of what we heard today and to examine it even more rigorously and in greater detail. So don't leave with a sense of unfulfillment or despair. You have a second chance. It's rare that we have a person who comes from outside of the city who gives a presentation and then there's a possibility of a follow-up, okay? So let's be patient with each other and also think of tomorrow. Now, who wanted to make the first statement? Jeune, toi. Just a moment, I'll get to you.
J'avais pas compris la question. Moi.
Comment?
Je pensais que tu demandais qui allait venir demain. J'avais pas de question à poser immédiatement.
Who else? You had a question?
Yes, well, thank you very much to begin with. I agree with most of what you say. I just want to highlight two things which I think I'm very serious and which I disagree. The first is simply your idea that these hierarchical oppressive systems are Western and is completely off the track. I mean, you see them in China, in the Aztecs.
I didn't say it was just Western.
Well,
I would
they're
agree
very
with you.
closely associated.
They're not just Western.
And the other point is that you failed to mention the only factor that matters for the future of the planet, which is greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Not even a mention. If we lose sight of that very key element, we don't have a project. You know, we don't have any social project, anything to stop climate change.
Okay.
That's just 2 points.
Thank you.
Any others?
Please, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. Super inspiring talk. I'd love to hear a little bit more about how we build this counter power, especially because I think there are a lot of movements, like you say, they are fragmented, they are, but I think to create that kind of movement we need, or that counter power, we need movement of movements, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we can't do that by saying, hey, all you other movements, hey, Black Lives Matter, come learn about social ecology. Like it can't be like you can't tell other movements how to think. So I'm wondering about how to bring this movement and movement together to create a counter power that could make super change without imposing a certain theory or perspective on other movements.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Well, I think it's not we're not in a position to impose anything on any movements, for better or worse. What we can do, though, is try to convince people of the analysis that I've offered. And it's not simply saying, hey, what you're doing is wrong and stop doing what you're doing and do what I tell you to do. It's rather, yes, what you're doing is necessary and important, but we need to deepen the analysis and find common ground and recognize the common roots of all of these individual problems that we're trying to address. and we need to focus energy on transforming those underlying structures that create those problems. So I don't have a formulaic way of how we do that, but I have seen, once again, that there is a growing awareness of those interconnections and a growing frustration with the limitations of some single-issue protest politics. And I'm also privileged to be in touch with a number of groups in the US that have developed this more holistic analysis and are organizing assemblies in their neighborhoods. There are groups, and in fact, we're planning a major convention of those groups in the fall. And there are groups in Los Angeles, and Seattle, and Portland, Oregon, and Olympia, Washington, in Detroit, Michigan, in Minneapolis, in Milwaukee, in Brooklyn, in Burlington, all over the country, in Jackson, Mississippi, actually one of the most significant and most important movements, which is really sort of putting all of this together, is the movement which recently elected Chakwa Antar Lumumba mayor of Jackson. And he comes from a black nationalist background, but their program is one of, first of all, seizing political power through electing a mayor and a city council. Secondly, creating cooperatives. They have an organization called Cooperative Jackson, which is doing this kind of multi-level organizing of producers and consumers co-ops, and then trying to coordinate them into a cooperative alliance, and creating neighborhood assemblies. So they're sort of putting it all together there. And that might be an interesting model for folks to take a look at. But at any rate, so I do think that this movement is developing and is growing. We've seen a lot of people who were involved in the Occupy movement have gone out and now are located and organizing in neighborhoods out in the Rockaways, in Brooklyn, in Queens, all over the place in New York. So I think that people are receptive to these ideas, that there are some good developing models out there that we can look to. And increasingly, I think as the crisis deepens, people are going to become much more attuned to the kind of in-depth critical analysis that's going to be necessary to address it.
I would add a footnote, if I may. Here in Montreal, it's also happening, to mention one point amongst others. This challenge of bringing people together who are interested in different issues, different aspects of the social question, of the crisis in our society, is very difficult, as Dan has illustrated. People tend to be single-issued, and there is difficulty for the best of us to understand that what we're concerned with has a connection with what you're concerned with. It's a learning process that you have to get involved in. And what happened after the November municipal elections here in Montreal, a number of us veterans who have gone through that experience in the last many decades of the history of Montreal decided to do something innovative. We said to ourselves, we're not going to sit back and let the new party in power just do its own thing. A very dangerous but inevitable response of people who work very, very hard at the grassroots level and work in an election campaign and say, well, now the good guys have been elected, let them do their job. Big mistake. On the contrary, the best of us have to get together, see the relationship between issues, and see how we can work together to do two things. A very interesting slogan came out of that first successful meeting that we had in early December. The slogan is, we're going to be a watchdog on them, but we're also going to be a guide dog. Okay? In other words, where they go off the rails, we're going to knock them on the head. And where they do something useful, we might say a few complimentary comments. Okay? Like, for example, just an example. For the last number of years, we have fought very hard in the Milton Park community here to put under protection a piece of green space on Milton Street called the Notman Garden. It's a very historic place. I won't go into all the details. I mean, there's a lot of stuff on the web, okay? And we worked pretty hard to do it. And Monday night, at the Borough Council meeting, the Borough Council announced that they were going to expropriate the Notland Gardens because they're fed up with trying to negotiate with the current owner who wants more and more and more money. They're going to expropriate it. So I got up and spoke during the question period. And I, who am known as a critic of the people in power, congratulated them. So in that sense, we are also guide dogs. When they do something useful, we will say, okay. But otherwise, they're going to get wrapped on the knuckles. So what we did is we created the Montreal Urban Left, which brings together activists, not just yackers, but activists, people who do things, and try to work things together of how we can act together. So what Dan is describing as a growing phenomenon in the United States, it's also happening here in our own city.
Yeah, I just like to, I agree with all that, and I think the political involvement is really important. So not only sort of be urban left, but we can all be members of these groups. It's very easy to be a member of, say, Project Montreal, which is a progressive sort of leaning, and make sure, and it's sort of, it's good to be from the inside, and you go to their meetings and you talk to the people there, and then therefore, you know, the same with the Democrats in the States, you know, and there is, that's happening in the States. I see there's sort of, you know, there's the Bernie Sanders sort of wing, so to speak, you know. But I just wanted to emphasize that I was recently reading George Monbiot, was a latest book, but he talked about the need for a new narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's very true. We need a new narrative of who we are. And it needs to be based on, because we sort of like, the capitalist has a narrative of who are people. We're basically selfish people that has to have this sort of system to function. Whereas in fact, as an anthropologist, you know, by nature, we are actually cooperative.
Of course.
And so we have to build up, I think we have to develop some sort of narrative, who we are. The narrative includes, you know, why things are going wrong, et cetera, but I think there's a power in a story. And then somebody has to develop that story. And I just wanted to put that out there. So stop thinking of a story, everyone.
I agree. I agree completely. I'm a strong believer in narrative, and in fact, I published a novel. I have another one coming out soon, and it's telling a story that is informed by the sensibility, but hopefully doesn't require, you know, a degree in philosophy to get the point.
I'm sort of like more narrative about who we are as human beings.
No, understood.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
a piece of it.
Yeah.
Please.
I was wondering, are there any historical precedents that you're aware of for this kind of large-scale system change? And related to that, does social ecology have any position on Marvin Harris and the School of Cultural Materialism, and what that has to say about the feasibility of a large-scale egalitarian system?
Yeah. Well, interesting that you should ask for an example, because there is a current example which is quite striking and largely unknown, unfortunately, and that's what's going on in northern part of Syria right now, in Kurdistan, among the Kurdish people. And they're very much in the news because they've been so successful in expelling ISIS from their territory, and there's this alliance now with the US, but the Kurdish people there have adapted a system which is based on social ecology. Abdullah Öcalan, who is the leader really of the Kurdish liberation movement and their leading theoretician, he's been in jail for 18 years now. On an island, the only prisoner. He's sort of the Kurdish Nelson Mandela. He is the Kurdish Nelson Mandela. And he encountered Murray Bookchin's work when he was in prison, started reading, and initially they had been a sort of mainline Marxist national liberation group, and he rejected Marxism, and he's adopted the ideas of social ecology, and they've now established in a region that has a population of about 4 million people, a system called democratic confederalism, which is based on these same ideas that I've been talking about, emphasizes the creation of local assemblies, radical ecology, and feminism, and those are the pillars of the Kurdish movement. And it's active, it's working. They've created, and this is, of course, in the midst of a war against a vicious opponent, several wars, because now, of course, Turkey is invading this part of Kurdistan as well, because they're scared to death of these people, because they really represent a very new model for the Middle East. They've created multi-ethnic confederations. It's not just Kurds, it's also Arabs, Coptic Christians, and anyone who lives in that region. And they're all participating. They've created a structure in which women have to constitute 50% of every committee and every decision that's made. They have special women's defense committees set up in order to prevent rape and sexual abuse and protect women. They have women's military units, which have been incredibly effective in fighting ISIS. ISIS is terrified of them, because of course if you're killed by a woman, you won't get to go get the 70 virgins and meet Allah and all that. So yeah, that's one current example. And then there are other historical examples as well. One could look to the Spanish anarchists and during the Spanish Revolution, part of the Spanish Civil War. One can look to the sections in the Paris Commune in 1871. These are widespread, large-scale examples of how these ideas have been applied in the past.
Okay, who's going to ask the last question? Because I do want you to take an opportunity to look at all that fantastic selection of books before we call it quits. You want?
I just wanted to ask you about another movement that I have become familiar with and taught about, et cetera, that I think has a lot of affinity to social ecology, but doesn't necessarily use the terminology.
Mm-hmm.
They call themselves the community rights movement, and the essence of it is they help municipalities pass revolutionary bylaws that first of all ban some heinous environmental offense like fracking or industrial hog farming or something. Yeah. Secondly, they say in our town corporations don't have constitutional rights that would allow them to try to get around whatever ban they're trying to impose. In many cases, they're also establishing legal rights for ecosystems, but then finally, they're openly defying the state and federal level and saying, even if there are laws at these higher levels that contradict what we're trying to do here, we don't recognize them. And, it's led by a group called the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. Yep. And I was just wondering if you would agree that it's kind of at least an implicit application of something like social ecology.
Absolutely. I have a little familiarity with them. They started in Pennsylvania. A guy named Richard Grossman was really the founder. He's dead now. And he actually came to the Institute and worked with us. Okay. So yeah, there's a real affinity there, definitely.
Good. Well, thank you very much for being here, and we'll see you soon.
Oh, Nathan just reminded me I should also invite you all to come down to Vermont sometime and participate in some of the Institute for Social Ecology's activities. We do various kinds of educational programs. Our big event every summer in Vermont is what we call a summer gathering. It's a weekend of discussion and inspiration, lectures, very informal. People camp out, but very high-level discussion, and you're all welcome to attend. So,